Welcome to LGIU's Fireside Chat, an interview series for our Future Local Lab program, where we are joined by guests from around the world to discuss what the future holds for local government, with the emphasis firmly on what the sector could do now to start preparing for that future. I'm Dr. Greg Stride, and today I'm sitting down with Claudia Chwalisz. Claudia is the founder and CEO of Democracy Next, an international foundation dedicated to accelerating the adoption of citizens' assemblies and re-engaging people in democracy. Claudia was at the heart of designing the world's first permanent citizens' assemblies in Brussels in 2023, but her work has since expanded all over Europe. At the core, she envisions these assemblies as spaces for creative problem solving, emphasizing the three key pillars of sortition, deliberation, and rotation, which I'm certain we'll talk about in more detail today. Claudia also co-leads the Pop-Up Lab, where she explores AI's emerging role in enhancing citizens' assemblies. Her work is truly forward-thinking, as she seeks to address some of the biggest challenges and opportunities currently facing our democracy and communities, which is why we're very excited to have her join us on the Future Local Lab. Welcome, Claudia, and thank you for giving us your time.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Great to be here.
So to start with, please tell us a bit about your background. How did you become interested and involved in democracy advocacy in the first place?
Yeah, well, I mean, that takes a few steps back actually before Democracy Next and the work I'm doing now, because my initial entry point into all of this work is research that I was doing close to 15 years ago now, looking at populism and the extent to which people's disillusionment with politics and the system, but also a lack of voice and agency in shaping decisions affecting their lives was driving people to different populist parties and actors. And from that work, becoming quite convinced that it's one of the deep drivers of these trends that we've seen. It's obviously not the only thing, because that's a complex phenomenon. So there are economic, cultural factors that are related. But if you recognize that political dimension, from that moment onwards, you no longer think that we just need better economic policies and that's it. So my work then very quickly shifted and has been focused since that time around, well, what can we do about it? How can we give people a meaningful say in shaping that decisions that are affecting them? And from what started off as a relatively broad exploration of those questions, ended up becoming more focused on citizens' assemblies and what gets called deliberative democracy in particular. So we can probably dive into that a little bit more after that.
I think now would be a good time. Yeah. So just for our audience, could you explain a bit about what you do and how it began and your aspiration?
Yeah, well, so I think understanding what I do, the idea of citizens' assemblies is really central to it. So let me just explain, what do I mean by that? So perhaps rather than starting with an abstract definition, to just give you one example from the country where I'm living now, in France. One of the last citizens' assemblies that took place here was at the national level. The French government convened an assembly with 185 people. So these people were selected by a lottery process to be broadly representative of the diversity of French society. And they were tasked with coming up with proposals to the question of, should we update our existing legislation related to end of life and assisted dying, euthanasia and related issues, and if so, how? So to be able to answer such a question, this group of 185 people, they met for 27 days of deliberation over the course of 4 months, where they heard from over 60 experts, and experts in a very broad sense of the term, also including faith group leaders and doctors and people with lifelong illnesses, philosophers. So many different perspectives, and then they worked together to come up with what ended up being 67 very specific concrete recommendations for how the law should change, that they reached 92% consensus on, written up in a report of 176 pages. So I include all those little bits of detail because I think they highlight to what extent citizens' assemblies are quite different, I think, to many things that people are familiar with. And so they embody these three principles that you mentioned in the introduction of sortition, meaning the random selection of decision makers, deliberation, creating this structured space for informed decision making, and then rotation, referring to the idea that, in this instance, there were 185 people, but power rotates and that privilege of representation changes. So in the next assembly, it'll be a new group of people who are selected to be part of it.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's the core idea. And the work that we're doing at Democracy Next is wanting to have more of these kinds of citizens' assemblies that are set up, that are done in a high quality way, that are empowered, and that are also made permanent or institutionalized. And by that, I mean that there's actually a legal basis that can get established behind them, which outlines their relationship with elected officials, with public administrations, as well as other stakeholders.
That's fantastic. I think the bit that it's extraordinary to me is the idea of a 92% consensus, especially on a topic that's so divisive. And I just wonder, so I was wondering as you were saying that, what sort of problem is it that citizens' assemblies are there to solve, and how do they manage that?
Yeah, so that I mentioned that threshold because typically in a citizens' assembly, you're seeking at least 75 to 80% consensus around the recommendations of a group. And some recommendations sometimes in these processes have less of a threshold than that. So they might get included in a report, but saying these were talked about, but didn't achieve that high level of consensus. But I think what's astonishing when you look at assemblies that have taken place around the world is that, on many different contentious topics, because, well, actually, one of the things that I did before founding Democracy Next was I was at the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where I led their area of work around the future of democracy and innovative citizen participation. And one of the key things was a big study looking at the use of citizens' assemblies by governments around the world. So I gave one example, but that's actually one out of well over 700. I would say probably close to 1,000 today, because that database was last updated in 2023. So around 1,000 examples like this one. So there's a lot of data which also shows us what kinds of issues have these addressed, to go to your question that you just asked. And, the first answer to that is just like a really wide variety of policy topics have been addressed in this way. The most common types of issues that have been tackled tend to do with things around urban and strategic planning questions, health and environmental issues, infrastructure, like investment questions related to that. So typically the kinds of issues that tend to embody trade-offs, where it's not just obvious about like yes or no, or there's not just one way forward, but actually what you're needing to do is to manage different compromises and trade-offs that are needed between different stakeholders, different values. I think a lot of times people try and make a distinction between an issue perhaps like end of life versus, I don't know, a city's mobility plan, where one might seem more technical than the other. But actually, at the end of the day, all of these decisions are underpinned by questions about, well, what kind of society and what kind of community do we want to be living in, which are values-based questions. And of course, there's a technical dimension of information that you need to take into account, which is why the learning phase of these assemblies is so important. But at the end of the day, you need both the science as well as the deliberation around values when you're taking decisions that impact people in a democracy.
Absolutely, yeah. And you mentioned a little bit earlier about the institutions that, the democratic institutions that citizens' assemblies sit alongside. And I was just wondering, because of our own interest in local government, where does local government sit in that, in the examples that you've come across?
Yeah, so I didn't mention this, but actually, so the OECD study that I'm referring to has examples from all levels of government, and the vast majority, around 67% from the latest data that's available, are at the local level. So there's a huge number of examples, and if anything, actually, cities and other local governments have been leading the way in this movement, which at the OECD we've referred to as the deliberative wave, which has been kind of gaining momentum. And I think precisely because of the nature of issues to do with like urban planning, mobility plans, infrastructure, a lot of these kinds of questions actually come up more often at a local level, where in some ways too, you're dealing a bit less with like that big P partisan politics between like big left and right issues, and people are more concerned with like the street they live on, their children's school, like things that feel much more like small P politics in a way that concern everybody. And also cities, I think, have been at the forefront of some of the movement to institutional, which I was referring to earlier. So most of these hundreds of examples from the OECD are instances of one-off citizens' assemblies, which I think have, on the one hand, shown us the benefits of this kind of approach, in terms of we have a lot of evidence which shows us that when you gather people in this way, with structure, with time, with information, that people are astonishingly able to reach high levels of consensus, really detailed, concrete, effective policy recommendations that can enable actions on a lot of issues where politics might be stuck. But on the other hand, the one-off approach has also shown the limitations of relying on the political will on a moment in time, and I think have also shown one of the weaknesses in terms of the link then to impact and implementation and follow-up, where it hasn't always been the strongest, because you might have an assembly that has been initiated by one either political party or one department, but its recommendations might be touching numerous departments. You might need some continuity and follow-up and so on. So the move to institutionalize has really been, how do we make this a normal way that certain types of decisions get taken, and we transcend some of the typical politics as usual to be able to do that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there the sort of deliberative wave that's been going on during your time of working on citizens' assemblies. And I was just wondering, how have the processes and procedures and types of institutions evolved over that time, particularly in respect to the more permanent assemblies?
Yeah, well, so I mean, yeah, I've been working on this for quite a long time. I mean, I'm not also always permanent, like I'm not always involved in the actual facilitation of these things, but I've been involved in the design of a lot of assemblies, and particularly all of the world's first permanent ones, and then other like permanent things. And that's actually the focus of Democracy Next as well, that we're only kind of involved in projects where there is a desire to do something that is a more than one-off initiative. And I think what's been interesting to see is, well, first of all, there's more than one way you can do that. So that's also why, like, I've even from the OECD, it was very much a principles-based approach, that we know what kind of good practice principles there are that can guide the design, but there's many different ways in which you can put that in practice. So all of the different institutionalized models to date have a slightly different design to them. And I think they've also been pushing the bar in terms of impact and in terms of, I think, opening an imagination to how things could be different. So let me just give you one example, if that's okay, from what I think is the most impactful example to date in terms of the level to which citizens have been empowered, but also I think where that relationship between citizens and elected officials and public administration is also the strongest, because it's not just about trying to suggest we need to let's just replace the existing system or get rid of politicians or anything simplistic like that. It's more about how can we be evolving our governance systems to be more effective and more democratic. So in Paris, it's been since 2021 that they've set up the Permanent Citizens Assembly, where right now it's in its third cycle, where every September there's 100 new people who are randomly selected from across the city of Paris. They don't have to be necessarily French citizens. It can be anybody who's living there. And that group of 100 people will work from September until July of the following year. So it's quite a hefty commitment. And during that time, they'll actually be split up. So one of the working groups is going to devote more time to actually draft the text of this legislation. And another working group is going to spend a little bit less time coming up with kind of just more general policy proposals on another issue. So for the issue around the citizen bill, the Paris city government proposes 3 different topics on which it feels like there is really a need to take some action, and that they're open to really taking action on a citizen bill that comes out of this process. So in last year's cycle, the 3 options, for example, were around municipal policing, around advertisement in public space, and around homelessness. So on each of these 3, the 100 citizens in this assembly got a briefing in terms of these are the trade-offs, this is the nature of the problem that you would be working on. So they deliberated and they voted, and last year they voted to work on homelessness. So one of the working groups worked on homelessness. And then for the other working group, the assembly members had a more bottom-up deliberation to come up with different ideas of what topic would they want to work on. So a bit more of an agenda-setting role. And they decided to work on proposals for greening the city even more. And so just to give you an example of the extent to which they devoted time to work on this, that working group developing the bill, they had 5 plenary sessions, 11 working group sessions in small groups, 7 site visits. And then at the end of that, they had an initial set of around 40 recommendations. And that wasn't even the end of the process. So after that, they had 3 sets of workshops together with elected officials and with members from the public administration. And they also had, hearings or meetings with the 2 relevant committees that work on this topic. And then together with elected officials and members from the public administration, they refined and decided together the exact wording in the text of the citizen bill, which then went through the formal process of being submitted by the vice mayor of participation to the city council and was voted on and adopted. So I think that probably conveys to you how this is quite different to let's just have an open public consultation and hear from everybody about what we should do on this issue. And, maybe there's 10,000 responses, but it's very different to ask 10,000 people on this such a complex issue, what do you think we should do? And, the nature of what you get from that versus actually having a structured process where people hear from many different experts, consider the trade-offs, the difficulties, how they're going to pay for their proposals, and really like the depth of those things that are hard to decide on. And then they work to that high level of consensus together. I think it just conveys, like, in the details, beyond the abstract ideas and principles, like how this works and why I'm maybe so animated by wanting to advance these ideas and encouraging more local governments and governments more widely to be experimenting with really changing the relationship that they have with their citizens.
It's a really useful example, and it left me wondering throughout it, because I can see the appeal of, if you're the Paris city government, we have these topics that we'd like some sort of deliberation on, and we can sort of, in a way, hand it over to the citizens' assemblies to do that difficult work of finding consensus. How has it been received within the Paris city government, if you don't mind me asking? Has there generally been a positive reception of these citizens' assemblies there?
Yeah, so generally, yes. And even to set up the existence of this citizens' assembly, the Paris City Council had voted to, basically the way it's institutionalized in Paris is that there's an internal regulation that sets out how Paris City Council as an institution functions. And so they amended that document to also include the existence of the citizens' assembly and its relationship with Paris City Council, that then had to be voted on by a majority vote to be adopted. So that's what changed back in 2021 when this was set up. And so it wasn't unanimously voted on, but there was more than a majority that supported this, and more than just the parties that were part of the coalition in government at the time as well. So there has been a little bit of, I think, questioning by some members of the city council, which I think, to be honest, has been the case in many places to some extent as well. But there is general widespread support for this. And I think also it comes through the action of actually being something that's effective and leading to very detailed, concrete, thought through, evidence-based policies that are coming out of it. It's quite hard, I think, to argue against the existence of this.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask as well, is where you do see opposition to citizens' assemblies, assuming that you do see some, how do you tackle that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I've tended to work also mostly with those who are, I don't know, those leading the change and are already energized and wanting to do something. And also, especially when it's come to the institutionalization agenda, there's also been a huge amount of effort in every place that I've been involved in to make sure that efforts are made to also engage with the opposition, to get a full city council on board. So actually, Paris is a little bit of the exception, because in most other places, there has been full support also from the opposition. There's been very little resistance, at least amongst elected officials, for assemblies. And I think many politicians also realize the value of having something like this, and also how it helps to transcend some of the typical political party divides. And it's been important in the sense of, like, for example, one of the other places that I worked in to institutionalize a local citizens assembly, much smaller city or town, even 20,000 people in the Basque country in Spain. And again, we had full support from both the city council and the opposition. And then, after they had their very first assembly process take place, there was an election and a change in government, and it was the former opposition that was now in government. But because they'd been involved in the whole process, they were the ones taking the lead on the actual work to institutionalize and pass new legislation that would establish this assembly permanently, and now has been leading the other follow-on assembly processes that have taken place. So in terms of this not becoming something that becomes politicized and associated just with one political party, that's been really, I think, quite an important learning and takeaway over the years, and it is rather achievable. And this change has also been both led by but supported by elected officials from all sorts of different political parties. So there hasn't been just one dominant leaning or other. And actually, there was a recent paper that just came out looking at this based on the OECD data, at least for all the European countries, which showed that it's really been like a very even split in terms of the political leanings. But in terms of where does opposition sometimes come from, I mean, this really depends on the context. I think sometimes it can come a bit more from civil servants than elected officials, actually, in a sense of, and I think it's quite maybe a normal and natural first instinct of a reaction of like, well, we are experts on these topics and we are here to take decisions and do stuff on this and so on. So there's like that fine balance of saying, like, of course, like there is expertise in a civil service, and also sometimes the opposition can come from civil society actors or NGOs that are working on certain issues, again from that same space of like, well, we know these issues inside out and we're advocating for a certain position and so on, and like, why are we going to ask just like everyday people who might not know something from the beginning? But I think going back to something I said earlier on in the conversation, that, you know, when we're dealing especially with maybe some of the more contentious issues where people are a bit divided, and I guess no matter what you do as a city government, somebody's going to be unhappy. So you need to have a process in place, though, that balances this need for expertise, for evidence, for data, but also for people's values and people having the space to deliberate, to weigh all of that together, and being able to actually take decisions off of the back of that. So you do need the expertise from the civil servants. You do need input from civil society. But at the end of the day, if you want to also be able to take action on an issue where there's maybe deadlock or people are quite divided, then having a legitimate process in place is really helpful for that.
Many of our listeners will be dealing with these types of thorny issues, so I'm certain that they'll be able to sympathize with that. To take us back to something you said very early on in the conversation about how you got into citizens' assemblies in the first place, you mentioned a bit about looking at democracy, particularly populism, and I was just wondering, what would you say are the warning signs that a democracy might be in a bit of trouble?
That's a big question. It's funny, actually, the research I was doing at that time, it was when I was living in London and the UK. The work, like some of the, at least the polling work that I did actually was all like UK based that I was looking at. And I mean, I think some of the kind of warning signs about a bit of trouble have actually been there for quite a long time now. Actually, the book that I wrote off the back of that research was called The Populist Signal, Why Politics and Democracy Need to Change, because it felt like there were all these signals that when you looked at all sorts of kinds of data in terms of people's trust in government, but also trust in one another, trust in institutions, their sense of, agency and voice in being able to have an impact on things. So in the academic literature, that sometimes gets called political efficacy. And, you know, I personally think that the sense of disillusionment that many people feel is quite legitimate. And, you know, the kinds of reforms that often get proposed or talked about, like to do with changing the electoral system, for example, or maybe campaign financing reform and so on. Like, okay, maybe things might be marginally better. But when you look across Europe and when you look across like other parts of the world to countries that have all sorts of different kinds of beautiful proportional representation systems and wonderful campaign finance rules and all sorts of other stuff, they have the same deeper problems, I think, when it comes to people's sense of distrust, disillusionment, lack of belonging, lack of voice, lack of really being able to influence. Like people, I mean, why did take back control resonate with so many people as a phrase? Like people feel like they just don't actually have a sense of being able to influence the direction in which things are going, whether that's locally or nationally or otherwise. And so that's where my interest comes in. Well, what can we do about that? And I don't think that the kinds of reforms that are tinkering on the edges, and I'm not really convinced by the sort of like mass participatory initiatives that I mentioned, like, you know, let's just open some big consultation where we hear from thousands of people. But, you know, I've never participated in one of those things. Like, you just know that those are being done to tick a little bit of a box. Whereas I think we need some really meaningful change that could actually start shifting power and changing who is deciding and how are we taking decisions together. And I don't think this is going to be some sort of like overnight short-term change. And it's also why I'm interested in particular in institutionalization, because I don't think it's going to be just with one assembly once with 50 people that's going to change either. But you can start to imagine how things could start to shift as this becomes a more normal way of making decisions at different levels of government on all sorts of issues. There's no shortage of issues, I think, that merit some deep public deliberation on them. And then the last bit, actually, and this is, I haven't really talked about this yet, but it's part of the work we're doing at Democracy Next, is also about how do we bring these same principles of sortition, deliberation, and rotation into the governance and decision-making of other kinds of institutions and organizations of daily life, like in our schools and school boards and universities and workplaces and our financial institutions. So I think there's a wider set of I guess, reforms and new types of shifts in governance and decision making that we could be applying that would start to really, I think, shift what people's notion of democracy even is, but also open up more opportunities for people to have meaningful say, knowing that also other people like them are involved. Because to me, that's part of the beauty of sortition as well, because we can't all be involved in every decision all the time either, nor should we. We have our lives and our families, etc. So with sortition, the idea is more that maybe once or twice in your life, you devote those X amount of days and months to doing something, knowing that other people like you are also doing that. And sortition in itself really captures the essence that everybody has the dignity and capacity to be playing that meaningful role, that it's not reserved just for some elite or some group of people to do this, that it's really for everybody.
Well, that's exactly the next question I wanted to ask, is how have citizens' assemblies, and particularly the idea of sortition, how have they encouraged participation by groups that are otherwise potentially marginalized?
Yeah, definitely. Well, when you look into the research about who tends to participate in all sorts of political and other kinds of activities, that tends to be more highly educated, and, certain demographics are much more likely men more than women, etc. Whereas with sortition, the idea is, like, in practice, how this typically tends to happen is that there are two stages to a sortition process. So in a first instance, there's a very large number of invitations that will go out. So that can be maybe between 10 to 30,000 people, depending on the scale of the community. And in that invitation, which is typically a physical letter in the post, the issue that people will be deliberating on is outlined, how this process will work in terms of how many meetings and stuff. There is also information about the fact that, well, people are paid to be part of these assemblies. Childcare is provided. Things that help to break down those barriers typically to participating are covered, as well as maybe FAQs around stuff like, do I need to wear a suit? No, you don't. Like, all the things that kind of help as many people say yes to that initial invite in the first place. And then amongst everybody who says yes, there is still some bias, but you've also reached a lot of people who don't typically vote or participate in a political party or go to town hall meetings or anything like this. So you have reached people who are not your, like, usual participants that are dominating in other realms of public life today. And so amongst that group, you do a second lottery process, but this time the technical word is stratifying, which just means having a process to ensure that that final group is broadly representative when it comes to things like gender, age, maybe education level, geography. At the end of the day, it's a political decision to decide by which criteria do we want this group to be representative as well. So it tends to vary a little bit, but those are typically the sorts of things that people decide.
That is really useful, thank you. I was just wondering, off the back of that, we've spoken a little bit there about disillusionment, and we know there's different groups that tend to be more or less disillusioned. One thing that we haven't yet spoken about is things like the concept of misinformation or disinformation. And I was just wondering how citizens' assemblies work to sort of combat that, the idea that people have these ingrained, potentially biased information sources that are more complex when dealing with issues, and whether you've seen the impact of those on citizens' assemblies' work.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I think this interaction with dis and misinformation questions is complex in a number of ways. But actually, part of the beauty of a citizens' assembly as well is that this whole group of people actually has access to the same information. And it's based on that same information that they're also deliberating and deciding about and hearing from a wide diversity of sources, also having time to request additional information if needed. So that typically happens in these assemblies as well. Of course, that doesn't help to counteract in a larger scale way like other trends around this. But I think one thing that's really interesting is that when you look into issues around dis and misinformation and look into, like, who is spreading this and what is motivating people to do so in the first place, actually it correlates quite highly with things like it's people who tend to be quite lonely, who lack a sense of belonging, who are a bit isolated. And so it's also by doing something to tackle those deeper roots of, like, why are people even sharing disinformation in the first place, that I think we'll have a better chance of, like, dealing with some of this issue more widely as well. So obviously, again, I'm not suggesting citizens' assemblies are a silver bullet for dealing with disinformation, so don't, like, misquote me there or anything. But I think they're that the whole process is only positively contributing to various aspects in terms of like helping people have shared reliable information around a complex issue, because also all of the information that gets shared with an assembly also gets publicly shared, usually on a website, usually all of the like presentations by experts and stakeholders, those are recorded and also publicly available and so on. So again, not that it's a huge mass of people that's necessarily watching this. I would say it's mostly also for the benefit of journalists, but also anyone who might want to try and learn a bit more about a topic or might be skeptical can go and just find all the information as well that people were presented with. And I think, well, we have seen on issues that have been of high societal importance and maybe controversy. So, for example, in Ireland, there was an assembly now quite a while ago, but around issues to do with abortion and whether the constitution should be changed around this. So there were around 100,000 people that watched the live streams during that assembly process. So not an insignificant number, I think. So it's not that much for every assembly, and certainly not on the local ones on maybe mobility issues or something. But still, that information is there. And I think depending on what the communication campaigns are around these assemblies, I think there's a positive potential in terms of contributing to addressing this issue too.
And you've mentioned a couple of bits of technology there that are relatively modern, live streaming and the publication of things online. I was just wondering, in terms of the technology side of things, what technologies you see that could be developing our relationship with democracy and where the opportunities are there?
Yeah, the tech question is quite a big one, I think, in the field right now too. And actually next week we're publishing a paper with my colleague Sammy McKinney, who's our AI and Deliberation Fellow, who's also doing a PhD at Cambridge right now, around 5 dimensions of scaling deliberation and how that interacts with AI. So it's obviously not the only aspect because it's quite focused also on scaling, but we have been exploring more broadly actually the different ways in which you can be using technology to be enhancing deliberation. And I think one of the things that we've noticed is that more widely there's been very different kinds of approaches to this question, and I think different philosophies, different things being tested. I think where I sit on this question is, to me, the most interesting questions relate to wanting to think about how technology can be helping to enhance the quality and therefore also the transparency, legitimacy, trust and trustworthiness of these assemblies, rather than necessarily from a mindset of like efficiency or wanting to make them shorter or faster or replace human facilitators, which, just to give a shorthand, I think of some of the divergences in the field, there are people who are really working on all of those things. And, perhaps we are in an early stage and it's worthy to be just like testing and seeing what's possible. But in terms of like why I even believe in citizens' assemblies and addressing the problems with democracy that you were asking me about earlier, like, I don't think there's a magic shortcut to those deep problems that we have in terms of people's sense of belonging and distrust and polarization. And I think we need people to spend lengthy amounts of time in person together doing the hard work of finding common ground on the collective issues that we face. And I don't think there's a benefit to trying to make that process faster somehow or skip parts of it or somehow we can be helping. So, for example, at Demnex, we've been working with the MIT Center for Constructive Communication with this pop-up lab that you mentioned around tech-enhanced citizens' assemblies, testing out different ways in which we could be, for instance, recording all of the conversations that are taking place. Again, with caveats in terms of like recordings from small group conversations still staying private to a wider public and only being accessible to researchers and to the group that's within the assembly. But one of the issues, I think, in terms of quality-wise, that in a citizens' assembly, typically there's a dynamic where you're going back and forth between a plenary, meaning a conversation with everybody, and small group conversations all the time. And so I think a lot of richness gets lost from all of those small groups. I think you don't always have the same consistent and very objective reporting back process of how are we capturing all of the information and the data and the richness of the conversations. You've probably also been in a small group where someone has reported back and you're like, was I part of the same conversation conversation as you. So I think there's ways in which we can be using technology to have a more objective but also fuller process of capturing that data, but also being able to share back highlights and the voices of people that were actually part of it. And so those are some of the things that we're experimenting with. There's obviously also stuff around like AI summarization and those sorts of things. But again, that requires evaluation in terms of how it's capturing really the accuracy and representativeness and some of the nuance in what's been said too. I think also when it comes to the wider outputs of what gets shared. So, typically at the end of an assembly, you might have a PDF report that's 176 pages long. And that's needed for the legislative process. But if you're trying to get some wider communication with a wider public, I think having more voice-based outputs, but also you can do interesting research that's not possible before we've started trying to record the entirety of these deliberations, where you can actually have a better sense of, well, what was the genesis of each of these ideas and how did the conversation flow around them? And you can pull out some also the voice highlights from what took place. And so there's different things like that that we're also working on in terms of how could we be using technology in thoughtful ways to try and, to make this an even better kind of process, while still really being thoughtful and intentional about the human aspects that matter. Like, okay, maybe it could be possible to replace the human facilitators, but like, do we actually want to do that? And, I think being very thoughtful about those kind of questions of like, even if it's possible, should we do it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I can imagine some of these technologies being things that traditional democratic institutions like local councils might be looking at as well.
Sure.
Even if they're tested in citizens' assemblies, there might be something that could be moved around to other democratic institutions. And that leads me on very nicely to my final question for you, Claudia, which is, what are your hopes for the future of local democracy?
So my hopes for the future of local democracy is a vision actually of a deliberative place where it's not just at the, let's say, city council level where you have a permanent citizens assembly where on an ongoing basis you have new groups of people who are actually, drafting local legislation together with elected officials, but that you also have these assemblies that are taking place in schools and universities and workplaces and other kinds of organizations. Museums are also cultural institutions that we've been working with as well. And that this starts to become a new normal, that there's new networks that emerge, that the positive ripple effects get spread even wider. Because I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the animating forces for me is also seeing how, because of the fact that sortition also brings in so many people who don't typically participate, it really activates that sense of agency amongst so many people who end up going on to form new local associations, might get involved more in local politics or run for office or, decide to change jobs or do things that like have a more direct impact also on their communities. People volunteer more. And so if we imagine the ripple effects of a deliberative place where these kinds of assembly processes and deliberation become a new norm, then I can imagine how over the longer term, there's a really positive effect in terms of shifting those relationships to do with like relationships between decision makers and citizens, but also who become decision makers themselves on a more ongoing basis. But I think also all those metrics around belonging and polarization and trust and social cohesion, like I really want to be able to do some bigger studies around places that are starting to head in this direction and what are the impacts on this, because again, we don't have the data now because nowhere, as far as I know, is actually doing this. But my hypothesis is that that would be a really impactful change on all of those things in a positive direction.
That's a really exciting vision. I just want to finally say, Claudia, thank you so much for talking with me today and sharing your expertise with LGIU and our listeners. And thank you to all of our listeners. We'll be back soon with more expert interviews for the Future Local Lab. But in the meantime, you can find more at lgiu.org.